This conference will now be recorded.
So for those who don't know, the Great Lakes Commission is an interstate compact agency that was established under state and U.S. federal law in the 1950s that's dedicated to promoting a strong economy, healthy environment, and high quality of life for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region and its residents. The commission consists of governor's appointees, state legislators, and agency officials from the 8 Great Lake member states. And the provinces of Ontario and Quebec also have associate membership status. So in 2017, along with partners from several of our member states and provinces, GLC staff set out to investigate the status of water infrastructure in the Great Lakes Basin and the need for additional financing. And in our research, we concluded that there is, in fact, a significant regional investment gap in water infrastructure financing that's projected to grow each year if nothing changes. Our findings were summarized in our Joint Action Plan for Clean Water Infrastructure and Services in the Great Lakes region. So that figure that you see on the bottom left of your screen, that comes out of our report, and it shows that we found that by 2037, there would be a $271 billion investment gap in clean water and drinking water infrastructure. And our research further pointed to the idea that that potentially is even an underestimation. So this action plan also includes a series of recommended actions at various levels of government to mitigate this gap. And I invite you all to go to Great Lakes Commission's website and read this action plan. But in short, our top recommendations called for increased regional coordination for water infrastructure asset management, as well as the need to comprehensively inventory and assess the current state of Great Lakes water infrastructure assets. The action plan was officially endorsed by the Great Lakes Commission in 2017, and that gave us as staff the directive to pursue these recommendations, and from that, the IWAM project was born. So here we all are. And in 2018, we received funding from the Joyce Foundation to pursue these recommendations. So now that I've explained why we're taking on this work, I'd like to break down exactly what we intend to do. First of all, we are hosting this series of webinars, which are going to take place between now and through the end of April. So in addition to this first webinar that focuses on the question of what is integrated water asset management, we'll have 3 more webinars that focus on different key aspects and considerations of effective integrated water asset management. The second webinar is going to focus on financing. The third is going to focus on technology and what's available for asset management and how it relates to integrated water asset management. And the fourth is going to bring together all of these ideas when we're going to hear about how leaders in this field are planning to, or in some cases have already implemented, some form of state or provincial level integrated water asset management programs. So in addition to this webinar series, we're also in the process of planning 2 in-person focus groups that are going to take place this spring. One of them will be in the US and the other will likely be held in Canada. And we're going to use these focus groups to be gathering more specific information on barriers and opportunities for a couple of communities that have an interest in advancing IWAM activities. And we're talking with people about where those might take place, but we haven't quite solidified that yet. And so all these webinars and focus groups are going to be rounded out with a robust literature review and also supplementary interviews and other just follow-up conversations with all the people who we connect with throughout the process of these webinars and focus groups. And we'll be doing all this generally through about the spring of 2019. So once we've completed all these tasks and this investigative work and networking, it's going to conclude with several deliverables. The first is an IWAM Phase 1 report, and this is going to be an assessment of regional barriers, opportunities, and best practices for catalyzing IWAM in the Great Lakes Basin. We're also going to be attempting to create draft regionally shared goals for IWAM. A second outcome is that we're going to be looking to solidify some of the partnerships that we've already began to build informally by creating a regional IWAM advisory team of experts and key partners who can help the Great Lakes Commission guide our work and also help steer our path for phase 2 that I'm going to talk about in a moment. We also hope to identify a couple of pilot locations, maybe 2 to 4 communities who are potentially interested in participating in phase 2, where we will be looking to implement the best practices and recommendations that come out of our IWAM phase 1 report. So the final deliverable of this first phase of our project is going to be a proposal, because we're not yet funded for the second phase, that also doubles as a work plan for implementing these best practices. So before I turn the mic over to our presenters, I'd just like to take a moment to create kind of a baseline for the question of the day, which once again, the focus of our webinar is, what is IWAM? So many of you have probably already seen the diagram on the left-hand side, and this is the US EPA's 5 core questions for asset management. This is the US EPA's 5 core questions for asset management. So they say that you should ask, what is the level of service that is needed for your assets? What is the current state of your assets? And what is the risk exposure for your assets? How can you minimize life cycle costs? And how can you create a long-term funding strategy? So on the right-hand side, I have a definition of asset management that I found from the International Organization for Standardization. According to them, asset management coordinates the financial, operational, maintenance, risk, and other asset-related activities of an organization to realize more value from its assets. So I think that these definitions are great, and we will certainly be using them to guide our work, but we've also found that the devil's in the details. And it gets a little confusing when you start to think about what exactly defines an asset that should be included in a management plan. In addition to pipes and pumps and catch basins and treatment plants, what about human assets? What about knowledge and built-up experience, time management tools? And you could ask the question, is asset management truly accomplished if you ask and answer all of these 5 questions from the EPA? Some people see asset management as taking a baseline inventory, or maybe tracking work orders for their field staff, or maybe they're looking to add community asset info into some kind of online database. So is all of this what asset management is, or does it require more to effectively implement an asset management strategy? And furthermore, how do you know if you've been effective? What is the correct metric of success for asset management? So these are some of the ideas that we've been thinking about leading up to this webinar. The second part of IWAM that I'd like to define, I can be a little bit more specific. So the I, and what do we mean by integration? So we mean integration in 2 different ways. The first is integration across traditionally siloed sectors. And this can include drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater, and a little bit newer on the scene would be green infrastructure. I think we can all agree that these sectors are often managed independently, even though their actions frequently directly impact each other. So we're looking for ways to increase integration across not only water sectors, but taking this a step further, what about transportation, communication, and energy sectors? Imagine a scenario where a city pays to put in a new road only to find that a year later they need scheduled maintenance on a water main line that's beneath it, so they have to tear it up. So we're looking for ways to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of asset management by better coordinating across all of these sectors. The second way that we mean that we're looking to further integrate asset management is regionally across political boundaries. So we're investigating ways that local communities can better coordinate with each other and at the county, state, and provincial, and even the national or international level to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of asset management. So going back to what I said earlier about the Great Lakes Commission being a regional and international organization, you can understand that we are well poised to help start conversations and look for opportunities to share best practices and increase the coordination of water infrastructure asset managers across the entire Great Lakes Basin. So with all of that in mind, I would like to pass control over to our first presenter, who is Dr. Tim Colling from Michigan Tech, and his presentation is titled Asset Management as a Business Practice.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan.
Thanks, Tim.
Let's see, would you mind passing? Thanks.
We had you for a second, Tim, and then it went away.
There we go. How's that?
Got it. Perfect.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As Dan said, my name is Tim Colling. I work for Michigan Tech University, and I'm the director of the Center for Technology and Training, as well as the Great Lakes Environmental Infrastructure Center here at Michigan Tech. And so Michigan Tech has a lot of programs that relate to infrastructure owners, whether they're water and sewer infrastructure owners like the Great Lakes Environmental Infrastructure Center, or their transportation infrastructure. We do a lot of work in both of those areas. And kind of our focus is working on civil infrastructure, again, whether it's transportation, water and sewer, anything that is in the built environment, and helping infrastructure owners manage their assets by doing training. We do applied research, demonstration projects, and then do direct technical assistance. So I thought I'd start out today, since I'm the first of the panelists to speak, I thought I'd start out with a little bit of history. And a lot of people have heard about asset management. There's a lot of discussion about it right now, and it seems like a new up-and-coming topic, but it's really not a new topic. So where did asset management start? And the answer might surprise you, because asset management started with manufacturing. It's kind of a surprise. People think, why would a manufacturing firm worry about asset management? But if you think about it, as manufacturing got more complex, you had industry that would start to use more and more complicated equipment, like presses and assembly lines. And so you had this massive capital investment in a manufacturing facility that had, say, an assembly line or a forge or a press. And you had people working in that facility. So the manufacturer is putting money out all the time on their infrastructure and on the people that work in the infrastructure. And the minute those plants go down, like if the assembly line goes down, they're not making any product. And the only way a manufacturer can make money is to sell product, be manufacturing, making product. So manufacturers learned really early that it made sense to understand the process, the business process that led to the parts that they're making, and to look for weak spots in that system. So for example, if we can replace a conveyor belt a little bit earlier, or if we do maintenance on a pump, hopefully that those parts of the manufacturing system won't break down. Well, we've got all these people trying to produce output. So a colleague of mine used to work at the Wixom assembly line when he was in college, and that was one of the largest manufacturing facilities under one roof in North America at one time. And he said it was really kind of funny because this massive process chain, and when the manufacturing, when the line would break down and everything would stop, he said the managers would just go nuts. They'd be running around trying to figure out what the problem was, and they're trying to make that decision: do we send everybody home and lose a whole day's of production, or do we pay people to stand around while we try to fix the problem? And so you can see it as a manufacturer, having your equipment break down or fail, working everything to failure, doesn't really pay. And that's true regardless of whether we're talking about manufacturing or we're talking about civil infrastructure like water systems. And so asset management's been applied to all sorts of different civil infrastructure. And even though the details are a little bit different, the process is basically the same. The core principles are the same. And so asset management is a very data-intensive process. And we take data and and analyze that data to make information and use that information to make decisions. So a couple key points about that whole process of getting from data to decisions. Data is expensive, period. Data collection processes tend to bloat, they cost money, but they're important if you're going to use them as a business process to try to make decisions about what you do on a daily basis. Give you an example, collecting data for, say, a linear asset, whether it's a road or a water system, can cost anywhere from, say, about $20 per mile to up to $300 a mile. So we recently did a study in Michigan that looked at the cost to collect data just on culverts. You wouldn't think that would be a very difficult thing, just find all these culverts on all the local roads in the state and take some basic data on it. During that study, we tried to benchmark how much it costs to collect culvert data, and it cost somewhere between $100 to $200 per mile of road, where we would collect all the culverts on that system. So for a typical county, that might cost $80,000 to $90,000 just to collect that data, just to get somebody out there to collect the data. So data being expensive, we have to make sure what we're collecting is important to us and that it can be transformed into something that's actionable, to information. So when we do analysis, we transform data into something that we can act on. And we can use that information to support decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis for managing our infrastructure. And we can use it to define relationships. So one of the key relationships that we look for is looking at funding and the condition of our asset, or the output of our asset. So in an ideal world in asset management, we're able to look at the impact of spending money different ways, whether that's on maintenance, whether it's on reconstruction projects or replacement of assets. And in a very well-defined asset management system, we can start to look at that impact. So if we do more or different types of work, what's going to be the outcome in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years for our asset? Is the condition going to get better? Is the service delivery going to get better? Is it going to get worse? So if we take that idea of proactive asset management with the water system, we have kind of this cycle that goes around. So we start out by having basic data, basic inventory information, which is basically where all our pieces and parts of the system are located, some basic details about the individual assets, how many, what type, when were they installed. Once we know what we have, how many miles of pipe, how many services, how many pieces and parts in the plant, we start to look at condition assessment. And so condition assessment can be something as detailed as physically taking a measurement by sending a camera or taking a coupon out of the asset or doing a visual assessment of the asset. Or it can be something that's a little bit more cost effective, less difficult, less involved, which could just be an age proxy or using break history as a proxy for condition. So once we know what we have and what shape it's in, ideally we're using that information to do planning and forecasting. And you see I have a computer program up there. I want to make one point. Asset management is not about software. It's not, software is just a formalization of a business process. So once you have a business process developed, software can help carry that business process out. But it's not about the software. So software, just putting software in place doesn't necessarily make a business process developed. So when we're doing planning and forecasting, we can start looking at the shape, the condition of our assets, the financial resources we have, and we can plan projects that go to construction that are going to make an impact on our overall condition and inventory of assets. And so this is just a cycle that goes continually on. So we're picking up new information about our asset. We're using that information to do plan projects and maintenance. And we forecast the outcome of that project and maintenance and then go out and do it in the field. So, if I had more time, we could talk a lot more about what the value of asset management is. And I know some of my other speakers are going to talk about the value. So I try to generalize really quickly kind of the different levels of value that utilities or infrastructure owners or even regulators get out of asset management. And there's kind of three levels the way I look at it. At the low level, asset management value comes from data access. So that's storage and retrieval of institutional data. So just the fact that we're writing this down in a methodical, consistent method and storing it somehow, it might be in software, it might be in a card file, doesn't really matter. One of the basic benefits is that data access and retrieval. So I'll give you an example. A friend of mine used to work for Scottish Water for years, and it was not uncommon for people that were maintenance superintendents to maintain a little black book, and that book would talk about basically everything they learned about the infrastructure that they were maintaining for years. So where a valve is, which direction the valve turns, when it was replaced, how deep the pipe was, what type of pipe it was, where the service line was. And they'd have little diagram sketches and all sorts of information in this little black book. And so every maintenance foreman kept that, and when you retired, it was standard practice to sell that to your incoming replacement. So it's kind of interesting because utility workers figured out how to monetize asset management data long before the actual utility figured out, boy, this is probably a good idea. We should own that data, we should manage that data, and we should keep it. So at a low level, again, asset management value comes from data access, getting things quicker, faster, and better from a data access standpoint. We start to get a kind of a wealth of information built. We can start doing some basic history analysis. So we can start looking at condition trends overall with our assets. So how long did our assets last? How has our asset overall condition changed versus what we've invested in it? And we can start to do different things like look at historical condition trends of funding versus historical condition trends in the infrastructure. We can also start to look at how long different assets last and how long different projects last once we build those projects. A big one in that kind of mid-level is coordination and sharing data. So the integrated part, I think, is important. Being able to get outside of your individual silo and work with other asset owners, especially if we're talking about assets that are in a road right of way. So Dan gave an example. You know, it really is tough to reconstruct a road and then find out that you've got a 48-inch or 32-inch or 30-inch water main that needs to be replaced underneath it. Okay, at a high level, the value from asset management comes from being able to determine future condition and predict future outcomes. So once we have understanding of how our asset behaves over time and we can model it, we can start to do forecasting and we can start to look forward. So we can see the outcomes of different investments or different projects that we do. We can start looking for opportunities to mitigate risk. So how do we keep the bad thing from happening, whether that's a service breakdown or a water leak or poor quality water? And ideally what we're trying to do, just like that little diagram I showed you before with the funding dial and asset condition, we're trying to link funding and the outcomes that come from making investments in the infrastructure, whether that investment is in buying something new or replacing a part of it or just maintaining it. So how do each of those activities go to change the quality or the performance of that asset? Kind of an overall idea when we start talking about the positive points of asset management is it gets us past project level management. So we're all pretty common. It's pretty common for people to understand project level, right? We build a project, it's done on time, on budget, and with high quality materials, and that's considered a success. But if we do that over and over again, does the overall network get better or worse? So it kind of asks the question, if you pave 5 miles of road every year, for example, does the overall network get better or worse? And it depends, right? If we have a network of, say, 500 miles of road and we're only paving 5 miles a year, it's going to take us 100 years to get around that network. And the typical road is going to last 15 to 20 years before it needs major work. So that's not a winning strategy. So as an example, chess is a good example of a game that has network level moves and project level moves. So the project level move in chess is moving the pieces because they all move a little differently depending on what's happened in the game or whether you're attacking or whether you're just moving. And so is moving a piece legally and putting it on a space that can't be taken in the very first turn. That would be a project level win. Network level win in chess is taking the other person's king, winning the game. And you have to be able to do both of them. You have to be able to do the project level right. It makes it real hard to win at chess if you can't do the project level right. but it doesn't automatically mean you win the network game if you do the project level right. My oldest son, who's in his mid-20s now, when he was 9, he started playing chess, and I thought, oh, I played chess, I'll play with him. We were playing a game, and I started taking pieces right away. Hey, I've got your rook, go, I've got your bishop, got your knight. And I thought, oh, this is going to be a just open and shut game. 10 moves, I had 5 pieces. And on the 11th move, he said, checkmate. And I looked at him and said, well, son, obviously you just don't know how this game is played. Oh, well, I'll be darned. He got checkmate. So he realized the network level win quicker than I did. I was counting my win by the pieces I was taking. He was counting his win by putting me in a position to be able to take my king very easily. So he understood that network level better than I did. And he beat me in like 11 moves. So that's when I decided chess was a stupid game and I wasn't going to play it anymore. But my son showed me the error of my ways. So in closing, before I turn it over to my next presenter, how can states or provinces, or I should just say government, support asset management implementation? I think there's a couple lessons that we've learned here in Michigan with asset management. One is, at the state level or province level, if you're going to try to get asset management going for your utilities or your infrastructure owners, focus on good for you, good for them. And what does that mean? It means that if you're going to require a utility owner and infrastructure owner to do something, it should have a positive benefit for them as well. There should be some because again, asset management is a business practice. It's very intimate to the individual utility owner. So there has to be value for the infrastructure owner for the activity that you're asking them to do. If not, it becomes a reporting requirement. And if it's a reporting requirement, reporting is a lot different than business process, because if my goal is just to report something to you as a regulated individual, it's like, okay, I'm going to report to you with the lowest amount of quality that keeps you from coming back to me or beating me with a stick. If I'm doing it as a business practice, if I have to collect data because I'm going to use it, if I have to analyze data because I'm going to use it, that's a whole different story. So focus on good for you, good for them. Second one, develop capacity and resources and work to try to develop a culture of asset management within utility owners or municipalities, not build more requirements. And again, if that kind of is in the same vein of good for you, good for them, if utilities or infrastructure have data, tools, and training, that helps them do the right thing and do their best jobs. Another big step, I think, in getting asset management implemented is highlight successes within utility owners or municipalities that are doing a good job. So if you have a model program, if you have somebody that's doing a good job, highlight their successes. If you don't have somebody that's kind of this early adopter that's out in front and doing good things, consider doing a pilot project where you put some of the resources that the state or province has to help a utility owner or infrastructure owner kind of get into that successful category, and then highlight and promote that success. Because if there's one thing we've learned from infrastructure owners is they learn very much from each other. So they learn from somebody who's successful, they'll try to emulate that behavior. Last point, incentivize good behavior. So Michigan, I know our state DNR has spent a lot of money with matching grant, or DEQ rather, has spent money with matching or grant programs to go out and start developing the inventory, start doing condition assessment. And those are great to get the ball rolling. But again, without the culture to adopt that data or the tools to use that data on a daily basis, it becomes difficult. So some things that would ask people to consider, bonus points for funding. So if somebody has an asset management program, does it make sense to give them preference for different funding packages? Or is there an option to allow a utility or an infrastructure owner more freedom or relief from certain requirements if they're already doing asset management? So if there's some reporting requirement that you're asking them to do already, is there some relief you can give them if they can show that they're doing an asset management program that essentially serves the same needs? So there's some food for thought. I'm going to turn it all over next to Christina. She's going to take over and talk about her experience in Lycoming County water and sewer.
Great, thanks, Tim. And now, while Ned is going to be passing control over to Christine, I'd just like to say again, for those who joined late, we've requested that if you could please just type in your name and your affiliation or who you work with into the chat box to make sure that we can fully capture the attendance for this event. We would appreciate it. And Christine, I'm looking at your home screen now, I believe.
Wonderful. So you can see my screen, okay?
Yep.
And you can hear me okay?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Great Lakes Commission for inviting me to join the group today. I'm Christine Weigle. I'm the Executive Director of Lycoming County Water and Sewer Authority, and I'm going to speak today about the value of asset management in terms of compliance and system management more directly. The first question that I usually get, and let me see if I can advance my slide here. The first question I usually get is, where is Lycoming County, Pennsylvania? Most know where Erie is, Pittsburgh, or Philadelphia. We're located in the north central tier of Pennsylvania, best known as the community that hosts the Little League World Series in August of each year. We're primarily rural with pockets of urbanized areas. And whether rural or urban, central Pennsylvania or the Great Lakes region, we are all faced with significantly increasing budgets, reductions in our customer bases with shifting and migrating demographics, all resulting in decreasing revenues. At the same time, we're seeing that these financial challenges are further aggravated by more stringent regulatory requirements. So for Lycoming County Water and Sewer Authority, we're a unique municipal authority in the Commonwealth of PA in that we share services in order to achieve compliance with water, wastewater, and stormwater regulations. And we do that by providing a variety of services in response to requests for assistance. So we serve as a resource to our communities. We're not all of Lycoming County. That makes us unique in that we're a resource and we serve upon request. We do that, and all these stars that are dotted across our county. It should be noted that Lycoming County is larger than the size of the state of Rhode Island, so we're spread far apart with very small service territories, with our largest service territory being about 3,000 customers, and our smallest being 34 customers. And although you would think that we have shared services and it might sound cost effective, we are not viewed as the least expensive alternative. We're quite the opposite. And that's really because none of these service territories are calling us when they're flush with cash and in compliance and all of their assets are running great. So we're called when there are major failures and compliance issues, which means that we're faced with major compliance and cash issues that require an immediate plan and often an immediate need to raise rates. Fortunately for our small systems and our small municipalities, the county recognized the need when they formed us to provide a resource for regulatory support. And our board members are not elected officials, but appointed, which allows them to focus instead on system needs and appropriate solutions for these systems, however sometimes unfavorable those solutions may be. And then our staff is tasked with assuring compliance and developing compliance plans, which means assessing the infrastructure and forcing us to do long-range planning for facilities when we evaluate compliance needs, both current and future. But most importantly, having only 22 employees and spread very thin across our county, it's really a means for us to schedule people and time, as well as our resource of money. So the question becomes, why has our services grown over time? I started at the authority in 2005. We had 7 employees. We currently have 22 employees. During a peak construction period, we had 27, but we're sort of right-sized for the number of systems that we serve right now. But the demand for our service has grown because our business is complex and it's expensive to adequately operate, manage, and maintain water and wastewater system in today's regulatory requirement. We're also struggling with the workforce limitations that Tim spoke about, with those existing experienced personnel carrying that black book in their pocket, retiring, and the skill set even becoming more technical to meet today's regulatory demands. So both the regulatory issues and the cost of dealing with aging infrastructure are driving the decision-making process to become more business-like. So we're talking about business plans and risk management plans, strategic plans, and fiscal planning for the long term. And it really doesn't matter if the system has 200 customers, 20,000 customers, or 200,000 customers. Our water infrastructure must be managed like a business to control and mitigate risk and provide reliable services, and also create a budget certainty at least as much as possible for affordability for our customers. For the customers that we serve, we are typically in a crisis mode, and our industry really is in a crisis mode due to aging infrastructure and our failure to maintain systems and reinvest in them over time. Unfortunately, we have devalued our services by systems historically keeping rates low, and thus we misled our customers and our community leaders to believing that the services that we provide are inexpensive or cheap, and we all know that they're not. So the systems that end up calling us, they've delayed infrastructure needs, they've deferred maintenance, and they've accepted a reactive business model in an effort to keep rates low. But what they find is that only drives the cost up, compromises compliance, and then creates this major crisis when the improvements are mandated by a regulatory agency later. For us, asset management is a means to manage not only what we think of as the traditional assets of pipes and pumps, but for people, time, and money. And those things are all finite. So if you had the people to do equipment repair or equipment replacement or construction but didn't have the money, you're not going to be able to do the project. If you have the money and don't have the people or the time, you're still not going to implement those projects. So it really does need to be evaluated and assessed holistically beyond the financial portion, but managing those assets for us is important so that we maintain compliance and reliability, especially when we're not located at all those stars that you saw on the map when I started. So to give you an example, we had a small water system in 2012 where the local officials, township supervisors, had contacted us to assist with compliance and regulatory needs of a water system in their community. The small system was owned and operated by an independent operating authority with some local residents appointed to serve on their board. The water system had a circuit rider operator, and they called on local contractors when they needed something. And the volunteer board members read water meters, they billed their customers, they paid their bills, and they did their financial reporting. That's not that unusual in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with the number of municipalities and systems that we have. But the volunteer board members, the local residents, knew that they were running up against compliance issues, and they had significant leaks in the system. So they knew that they needed to address the water loss, and they made the decision to take out their only water storage tank, take it offline to look for a leak. They did not notify their customers. They did not notify the regulators in advance. So with no plan and the lack of knowledge and experience, they made the decision and caused the system to be out of water for days. Their response was very reactive, and they were using information, as Tim spoke about, data and information that they had, but they used it inappropriately to make a decision that was not in the best interest of their customers. Also, during this period of time where they struggled, they were raising rates to cover costs, which could have been avoided, but they didn't have a plan. So their customer service really suffered, as did their compliance. I want to tell you that our authority, our involvement was not welcomed by the local people initially, despite the municipal officials calling us for assistance. It seems a bit odd, but it may be the human factor of pride that really took some effect there. So over several decades of little to no management, the system had spiraled out of control with no understanding to what really needed to be done to fix the problem. With unaccounted for water of over 300% and equipment failing at the filtration plant, they really were in a crisis mode. Even for our organization, this was a challenge to address because every problem was an emergency. The system was operating beyond its permitted capacity, and really the water filtration system needed to run 32 hours a day to keep up. And since there aren't 32 hours in a day, the system requirements were bypassed, permit conditions were overridden, lots of things were overlooked by the decision makers of this system. So in our involvement, our first job was to prioritize issues in order for us to move more quickly from a reactive and a crisis mode to normal operations. A significant rate increase was also necessary to address compliance issues, and those improvements were needed so immediately that there was no time to seek any funding. So the money that was used was strictly loan funds that were embedded into their rate structure. So armed with a plan, though, we notified Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection of our involvement, and as a regulatory agency, they were supportive of our systematic approach to address the issues in getting back on track with the permit requirements. We were utilizing our assessment and evaluation to develop a long-term plan, and in doing so, we were creating credibility, though, with the regulatory agency and addressing the competency issue, which was lacking in the prior 2 decades. Surprisingly, the customers supported our efforts quickly, despite the fact that rates were increasing, because their focus suddenly became system reliability. We had to have a lot of meetings at the local offices with the customers and the community leaders so they were comfortable and understood their plans. The solution really was asset management, and it was only successful because of the integrated nature and the holistic approach with all of the stakeholders involved. After getting the water losses under control and making sure customers had water at their tap, our shift was from reactive to proactive maintenance. And from there, very quickly, to long-term planning, asset management, and sustainability with regulatory compliance. All of that is asset management, business planning, compliance planning. And it was necessary for us because prior to the transfer of the water system to our authority, you'll see on this graph that their water usage was well over 100,000 gallons per day for several years. And usage over 100,000 gallons per day triggers another set of regulatory requirements, which are implemented by yet another regulatory agency. So we understood the regulatory impacts and needed to see this drop in water usage, this proactive and outreach then to that agency to say, here are what the problems were during that window of time, here's what we're doing to fix them. What that was as a result in major savings or cost avoidance of several $100,000s. So always being reactive is very overwhelming when your asset fails and your services are compromised. And assets do have a useful life and they will fail. It's just a matter of time as to when. So being prepared, not just knowing when, but having the people, time, and money to implement is so important. As Tim mentioned, inventory and condition assessment is extremely important. So that information is essential to have for decision making, but a lot of times when we're called in to assist, operators are too overwhelmed to even know where to start. So we always ask them, what are the issues that call you out at night? What are your regulatory issues? What do your customers complain about? What are the problems that occur and then reoccur? And maybe a few what-if questions. If I'm talking to a business manager or a board member, I ask for their audit and I search out their fixed asset table. Because a lot of times they are tabulated somewhere. How many miles of pipe do you have? What type of pipe is it? When was it installed? Sometimes we simply compile this on a piece of tablet paper as a starting point. But that simple exercise actually begins the process of setting priorities and becoming aware at an operator or a board level or a decision-making step. This integrated approach and stakeholder involvement is absolutely essential to the services that we provide that the community relies upon. It's especially important if there are compliance issues so that we are reaching out to the regulatory agencies. Many people are afraid to discuss the issues with the regulators before they're afraid to call them, but it's better to call them before they call you. And I can't overemphasize that the cost of compliance is far too great when you're out of compliance or your assets have already failed, because our experience with these systems that are in disarray is cost and affordability no longer become the driving factor in decision making when regulators are mandating and telling you exactly what you have to do and when you have to get that done by. So under the right circumstances, we do see that being open with regulators does create the trust and credibility. And oftentimes it allows more time to address the problems and to get support in obtaining funding. And customers absolutely need to be part of that discussion, because typically asset management or compliance planning will involve raising rates, sometimes aggressively if you're behind the 8 ball on compliance. In closing, the question of how can we advocate asset management is one that we ask all the time. And from a regulator standpoint, I have to agree with Tim. It cannot be another paperwork requirement or a regulatory submission. Asset management has to be viewed and seen as something that brings value. We can promote it as best practice so that systems understand that it will help reliability of systems. It will help control or at least manage costs and will help with regulatory compliance. If it becomes a submission that has to be made to a regulatory agency, it will be a one and done exercise. I'm going to give you this, you're going to put it on your shelf, and I'm done with it. Asset management is very fluid and dynamic, and it needs to be responsive to system needs. So avoid the stick approach and start with the carrot. Things like we're doing today, we're educating and training. Maybe we can provide templates for system operators and managers to work from. If a system doesn't have a plan, just start with the worst problems and start to create an awareness to address those problems first. And again, I have to reiterate what Tim says. If a funding agency can award grants based on a proactive approach to asset management, there's the carrot and not the stick. Leaders and decision makers have to understand the value of services that we provide so that they promote asset management too. So that integrated piece that we're talking about today is so important. So together we can take the appropriate steps to assure that public health and safety will be there in the water services that we provide. It helps to promote our long-term sustainability and our economic viability and future development opportunities for our communities as well. So regardless of size, we have to plan together and systematically manage our assets to come up with the best solutions, because our water infrastructure is critical to our communities and our future, and we see it every day with all of those stars on the map that we provide services to. So that's what I have for you today. Again, in closing, I have to reiterate a number of comments that Tim says. We've got to work together, and from a stakeholder community standpoint, the integrative approach is the best way to promote the services that we provide. So Dan, would you be the one that turns it over to Anna now?
So thank you very much, Christine. While we're switching over to Anna Wolf with Center for Neighborhood Technologies, I would just like to remind everyone, or if you didn't hear me say this, you signed out a couple minutes late. If you have any questions for our presenters, please go ahead and type them into the chat window, and we'll read them out once Anna's done with her presentation. And conversely, once Anna's done, we'll also invite people to take themselves off mute and just join the conversation live. So either way that you prefer. And Anna, we can now see your screen.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay?
And we can hear you, so you're good to go.
All right, perfect. Yeah, I'll echo Tim and Christine. Thanks so much to Great Lakes Commission for this opportunity, and for Dan and Ned for coordinating everything. As they mentioned, my name is Anna Wolf, and I work for the Center for Neighborhood Technology. And today I'll be talking about integrated water asset management from the perspective of achieving sustainable and resilient community outcomes. So CNT is a Chicago-based nonprofit. We've been around since the 80s, and our organization operates as a sort of innovations lab for urban sustainability. And a lot of our work is cross-sector. We work on issues related to transportation, water, climate resilience, and we also look at how public policy and data analytics can support decision-making and action on those topics. In general, we work from or operate from a principle that, urban problems are solved when we unite previously siloed sectors to achieve more impactful outcomes. And that's sort of going to be the theme of my presentation. And one quick example that I want to start off with to jumpstart my conversation on integrated water asset management is complete streets. By their nature, complete streets are designed to have sort of embedded green stormwater infrastructure features because those features also create a more walkable street. Things like trees and planters and wider sidewalks and bike lanes all produce the sort of walkability and the complete nature of a complete street design. So by achieving both improved transportation, water, and even economic outcomes, you can sort of broaden the possibility of funding sources to accomplish those projects and use one seed to feed many birds in that effort. So CNT sees integrated water asset management as needing to incorporate a broader set of assets, both as Tim and Christine mentioned, beyond our traditional water assets like our plants, pipes, tunnels, grates, etc. These assets are critical and should be managed proactively and strategically. But in the work that we've done, we talk about sort of water assets and more general, just sort of a community asset is inclusive of natural resources, land, and culture that makes the place unique. So by taking the built, natural, and cultural assets together, cities can make better investment decisions in their built infrastructure, addressing the needs of other interrelated areas that perhaps weren't a part of capital planning conversations or decision making. So on this slide, the top left is a suburban median bioswale. The top right is a vacant lot in Gary, Indiana. And the bottom right is a constructed wetland in Portland, Oregon. And each of these is an example of a project or an installation that's, well, the vacant lot isn't an installation, but an example of something that could or is achieving multiple water assets and a broader set of community goals. And therefore a better outcome. And underpinning this sort of reframing of how we think about water assets and community assets should be the inclusion of residents who can and should be allies and partners in helping municipal decision makers broaden the scope of what assets need to be paid attention to. So when we reframe our asset management goals to make more holistic and integrated decisions, we make different investment decisions. So these options listed in the table move from a more centralized approach to sort of the pipes and streets, massive pipes and massive streets framework to a more decentralized approach to a customer-oriented network, ensuring that cities are designing, city practitioners are designing, building, and investing in infrastructure in ways that both serve the system needs from a compliance perspective or otherwise, as well as community resident needs. And we've seen that the financing and funding world is sort of hitching on to this idea, figuring out ways to productively finance types of integrated asset projects by, to some degree, using traditional financing tools. So I'll just lay out a few examples of funding and financing options. The first one that we've been paying attention to is this social and environmental impact investing. It's sort of taking off right now as investors are paying more attention to not just their traditional economic returns, but also to social and environmental returns. And some of examples of this include the prominent green infrastructure pay for success projects in Baltimore, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. Investors are investing in certain stormwater quantity and quality outcomes using green infrastructure, and as opposed to simply investing to get a financial outcome. They will still receive a financial outcome, but it's contingent upon how well the project performs. So the investors really have an interest in a high performance, effective green infrastructure installation. And in general, social impact investors are likely to be more interested in an integrated approach, especially if that approach produces multiple social good outcomes like jobs, public health, environmental improvements. I touch on traditional municipal bonds just because, you know, they're not new, of course, but by working within our regulatory requirements and standards, but in new ways, cities can achieve perhaps more impactful outcomes with how they're using bond funds. So there are several cities that have been amending their consent decrees for, you know, EPA water quality issues to add in more green infrastructure solutions, acknowledging that GI has a broader set of community benefits attached, again, as opposed to just relying on gray infrastructure installations. And so they can use these, you know, bonding for these projects that are listed in their long-term control plans to scale up the implementation of some of these more integrated water management approaches. And then additionally, the Government Accounting Standards Boards has some standards that can help cities track their green infrastructure assets or their non-traditional fixed assets. So sort of tracking the life cycle of trees and other, you know, constructed wetlands that are producing a measurable community benefit, but aren't normally tracked in that way. And then GASB 62 allows cities to use traditional municipal bonds to finance the implementation of distributed green infrastructure on private property. So for instance, bond revenue could be used to support a private property rebate program. And if you're interested in learning more about that particular program, I would look at Earth Economics. They've done a lot of good research on that particular standard. There's also the sort of access to standard state revolving loan funds, which again are used frequently for clean and drinking water related projects. But there is a minimum of 10% of each state's state revolving loan funds that should be spent on green infrastructure projects. And that may be underutilized in some states by municipalities and should be looked at closely to sort of finance these more integrated water approaches. And then I just want to mention that there's a case of simply doing better at leveraging private investment. Water assets don't stop at the property line, and municipalities can create programs to share the burden of investment, incentivizing property owners to invest via rebates and cost share programs. These could be aimed at, again, implementing green infrastructure or replacing lead service lines, and even water and energy efficiency upgrades. Again, these investments benefit the system as a whole, but the private property owner also receives that benefit and so sort of buys into the process of investing. So to put some of these ideas into the real world, I'm going to talk about our Great Lakes Water Infrastructure Project. And this initiative is funded by the Mott Foundation. And through this effort, we are working with Great Lakes communities to help them innovate on their water systems to provide clean, affordable, and sustainable water. So this is how we framed up our sort of program problem statement. And this was touched on by both Tim and Christine as well. The cost of maintaining infrastructure is increasing as a result of higher policy standards, higher and better policy standards, climate change, and low investment in our infrastructure over the last century. And this results in particular in shrinking cities or cities that have lost their peak population, in agencies having smaller budgets as a result of fewer ratepayers. And oftentimes in a lot of these cities, the ratepayers tend to be lower income, making less money per capita, so resulting in an even lower budget to make the appropriate infrastructure investments. So these factors, of course, conspire to create increase infrastructure failure risk, as well as causing an untenable burden of cost to ratepayers, who are often shouldered with paying for these investments. So one way that we've been thinking about this problem is to expand our thinking on what assets to make investments in, or how we can make our investments benefit multiple types of assets and the corresponding users. And again, just sort of bringing back this this gray infrastructure, the gray versus green infrastructure example, as opposed to just focusing on the gray infrastructure, you might consider how investments could be made in a way that changes the way we interact with our land and resources to improve not just water quantity and quality issues, but also transportation, recreation, and community health priorities as well. So through this program, we worked with a few cities over the past year and a half to identify new ways to make decisions in their particular, water infrastructure assets. So we worked with Flint, Gary, and Dearborn, and I'll just give a little spiel about what we did with each of those communities. So in Flint, we provided technical assistance related to their desire to develop a water affordability strategy. We didn't spend too much time on the lead crisis, which is of course still top of mind for many of its residents, but rather we were focused on the city's legacy infrastructure, their overbuilt water infrastructure. We focused on the problem that's illustrated in this graph on the screen here, which shows the city's total revenue under existing water rates, that's the blue line, compared to the total revenue requirements that the city is going to need to make in water infrastructure investments over the next 30 years or so. So those two lines don't match up, they don't work out very well. And we weren't working with the city to figure out how to make all of these investments sort of work out. They're working with engineering firms to prioritize some of those major investments. But rather, we wanted to take a look at the broader realm of community affordability and improving the perception of the city's water system, which was damaged after the lead crisis. So we found a few opportunities for this sort of integrated approach to thinking about water assets and community assets. And first and foremost, the customers in the city of Flint should be considered allies in maintaining infrastructure because they should benefit from those improvements and see the benefits through transparent uses of data. So on that note, we recommend that the city take a closer look at how to use data as an asset, linking it to new water meters, to improved customer programs and efficiency programs, creating a triple bottom line benefit. And to sort of remove some of the administrative burden from developing a new data sharing system, we recommend that perhaps the city engage a third party that can roll out something like this with customer service as its primary goal. We also explored alternative income-based rate structures, underpinning the idea that residents should see water as a resource and asset to pay for, although this is complicated by the lead crisis. But just to say that, people will generally only pay what they can, and so prices should be set accordingly. Thereby the city would ultimately end up collecting more money if they're responsive to resident need and ability to pay. And then finally, we looked at linking water supply and energy assets by designing a water and energy efficiency program that targets vulnerable populations. So in Gary, Indiana, we worked with them on ways to scale up their green infrastructure. The city has done a really great job of implementing several green infrastructure projects over the years, including this rain garden that's pictured here in front of City Hall. And the projects perform pretty well in Gary. They have really sandy soil. The city would like to scale up that impact and get more both water quality and quantity outcomes from that scaled up impact. And so they were looking to use value-based financial solutions to modernize their infrastructure through using green infrastructure. So the specific context in Gary is quite similar to Flint in that the city has a lot of legacy and overbuilt infrastructure and pretty limited internal revenue to make sort of proactive and comprehensive capital investments. There are two major opportunities that came out of our work there. And the first is one that I've mentioned, is that because green infrastructure works well in Gary, and because it has so many attractive and associated community benefits, by valuing those benefits, you can invite interested impact investors to the table. Gary doesn't necessarily have the ability to themselves engage an impact investor, but they could engage with another group like Greenprint or their regional planning council to develop an investment package that would create a more holistic or regional approach to scaling this type of infrastructure. And we also identified land in Gary as a major water infrastructure asset. They've already done a lot of land use planning, looking at how their sort of major swaths of vacant land can be used for beautification efforts and conservation efforts, and a little bit for stormwater management. So they should continue doing this work to develop robust stormwater management plans and figure out ways to get those water quality and quantity improvements, all the while tying those into the broader integrated approach, thinking about the above ground uses and community benefits you get from those investments. And then finally in Dearborn, the city was looking for help as it explored creative alternatives to control stormwater management in its public right-of-way and on private properties. And Dearborn is another city where land use played a huge role in how we identified assets that should be taken together when making investment decisions. Dearborn is sort of auto central. It's got a very extensive suburban car-oriented street network, lots of alleys, lots of parking lots. Ford is headquartered there. And this sort of impervious land is actually a huge opportunity for them to scale up green infrastructure, again, benefiting water quality and quantity, and also improving the walkability and livability of the city. We also identified that in Dearborn, property owners are a good ally in scaling up green infrastructure, and there's a lot of single-family lots that would be hugely beneficial if the city were to more intentionally engage private property owners in implementing highly designed green infrastructure projects. To date, there hasn't been that much of a public engagement push, but planners in the city are working to develop sort of a private property cost share program. And we also noted that the city does a good job of putting together capital plans at the beginning of every fiscal year. And they don't necessarily think about green infrastructure or water management when they're putting together those capital plans. And so because they already have those processes in place, it's a good place for them to start inputting green infrastructure opportunities, pilots within the capital planning process. And then finally, one of the unique cases is that one of the unique things about Dearborn is that they haven't done a lot of investment in green infrastructure to date, but they are in a region that has a lot of city practitioners who are doing a lot of green infrastructure installation. And so their regional network of peer engineers is a huge asset for them as they work to scale up this type of investment. So I'll end by just saying, I think, the integrated water asset management framework can be unwieldy and complex to jump into right off the bat and try to create connections everywhere. It can be more helpful to integrate incrementally and identify, one or two actions that you're taking and think about how that's already integrated into other asset planning or how you could make it better integrated. And if, in doing so, who would you have to bring to the table to make that happen? And I'll note that CNT is doing another round of our Great Lakes Water Infrastructure Project work. And we're currently in the process of inviting cities to participate. So if you would like to get involved, please reach out to me at awolf@cnt.org. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Anna. So that concludes our three presenters. Thank you very much to all of you guys. So as I've said a couple times, if anybody has any questions, then they're welcome to type those into our chat box. Don't know if I've seen any, or also at this time, if you want to unmute yourself and join the conversation live, then we would invite you to do that. I guess just to get the ball rolling, one thing that jumped out at me that I'm really interested in, this is a question for Christine. What is the state of the, for example, the drinking water suppliers of the communities that are joining up with your sewer and water authority? And would there be an opportunity to also consolidate those to help them manage their assets, or is it a situation where their drinking water is totally up to par, but it was just the sewer that they're having problems with?
So I'm going to repeat the question because you were breaking up a little bit when you asked it. I think what you're asking is the state of water quality whenever systems ask us to help, whether it's drinking water or wastewater. Was that the basis of your question?
Yeah, well, I mean, if communities come to you, and so if we're talking about integrating these siloed water sectors, if one of the sectors is coming to you needing help, what is the state of the other sectors, and is there an opportunity for them to work together to try to solve their compliance problems?
The answer to your question is yes, there are lots of opportunities. The greatest challenge faced in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is the number of municipalities that we have and the continued control issues that we're faced with. So it really doesn't happen until there's a crisis in a community where we all start talking in one cohesive unit. Because our organization is now chartered to do both water, wastewater, and stormwater, and because our entity frequently interacts with the Department of Transportation, and we're involved in the county in terms of bridges and roads, it is more holistic, but the challenge that we have in the Commonwealth comes back to really planning. We're an implementing agency. We can talk to a lot of different entities and different communities, but bringing about real change in the Commonwealth will take a leader in a community at the planning level and a leader at an implementing level. The crisis, though, brings people together. The crisis can be compliance. It can be new regulations faced with new MS4 regulations, Chesapeake Bay requirements. Those are bringing people together to have broader perspective discussions about how best to solve problems and implement solutions. But unfortunately, in our municipal government sector, it's very fractured and fragmented and still remains a lot of control issues.
Great, thank you. One other question that I had in mind, and this ties into another sort of long-term overarching goal that the Great Lakes Commission has with this work. I don't know if anybody on the phone is familiar with Blue Accounting, which is another project that we work on. And Blue Accounting, it seeks to provide standard metrics to help track the success of environmental problems. And so on that note, and I'll let maybe Tim and Chris and Anna can start with this one, but I'd like to hear from all three of you. In each of the contexts of your work, how would you all define success of asset management or integrated asset management? What would be the appropriate metric of success?
This is Tim. I guess I'll take it first. So I think success for asset management means that the agency has changed how they're, whether it's a utility or a municipality, the infrastructure owner has taken control of how they do business. So they're not kind of just hunting around in the dark. They've fully implemented asset management. So that means that they have a strong tie between what they plan to do in terms of capital projects and maintenance projects and what the outcomes of those are going to be on the users, whether that's at the level of service level, what they can provide, or whether it's purely just conditional, what condition is the asset. And we typically measure that a few different ways. One is what data they have. Do they have a full set of data that they can draw from? Do they have a routine process for collecting that data? And then can they take that data and transform it into information that they can, and do they transform it into information that they can use to drive projects? In my opinion, that's where they've succeeded, is when they're starting to use their own data that they've collected on their own to drive their own business process.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the sort of making best use of data, making sure that the data is validated and is effectively capturing the state of the system. I'd also say one thing that I think is critical is that you're coordinating across departments, either internal to the municipality or, if the water utility isn't municipally owned, that there's some kind of engagement during the capital planning process. When you're figuring out where you're going to make investments for the year, you know where other departments are making investments, and you can coordinate efforts to make sure you're not digging twice. And another example I'll note of, I think, good practice when it comes to green infrastructure uptake is, I think Grand Rapids has adopted an approach where they consider green infrastructure as a first option when they're doing a new street capital improvement program. And so they're building in green infrastructure as one of their investment tools, as the first investment tool to consider. And then they can evaluate the cost and benefit and figure out if that's the approach they want to take. And so I think by sort of including that during the decision making, you can increase adoption and get those associated user benefits.
This is Christine. I have to agree with Anna on that as well. We start to see success when municipal officials start to reach out to us to ask about the streets projects. Those are sort of the easy things for a municipal official to see at a local level, because they don't want that street torn up again. But it would be a long-term plan if you just did it based on what section of street was being paved in a given year. So we try to get them to think holistically, and we're now seeing success because of the implications and the costs associated with the MS4 stormwater requirements in 3 small communities, where they're really starting to think about big picture improvements, because one community has land and 2 of the communities have larger requirements, but they can participate together in a partnership. And those are success stories just out of the gate. If people are willing to have that conversation, at least here in our local communities, that's a success.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And once again, I'd like to invite anybody who's on the call right now to chime in with questions, or if somebody feels that they disagree with something that's been said, or there's something critical to talking or to defining asset management or integrated water asset management, then feel free to join in. So some other questions that came to my mind hearing you guys present. Just what do you think that the primary barrier to implementing all these great ideas that you guys are talking about? Do you think it's that people don't agree with you or believe in this stuff, or financial? Is it cultural, or why is this all not happening, you think, in your opinion? Not happening yet, I should say.
This is Tim. So I think a lot of it is culture. So a lot of the focus on asset management, whether it's water, sewer, or transportation, has been on developing a culture of asset management. And again, if we think, not to beat the business process drum too strongly, but if you think about it, in order to adopt asset management, it's changing how an infrastructure owner makes decisions. So it's changing, what the basis of those decisions are, and it's going from kind of an art to more of a science. So you'd have managers that in the past were very good at knowing how their infrastructure was behaving, knowing what their infrastructure needed, and what types of projects needed to get done. But as the systems have grown and we don't have people that are in jobs for 40 or 30 years anymore, we need to come up with other ways of getting that really long history of practice by having methods for making decisions. So I think the biggest difficulty in making this change is that utilities or municipalities are so tied up in the work that they do every day. They're thin on staff that it's hard to make a overall change in how they do business. I mean, just think of if somebody came into your business, whatever you do during the day, and said, okay, we're going to change tomorrow, and we're going to do something as large as saying, okay, we're not going to use email for communication anymore. And that would totally set your world on end, right? If that happened tomorrow. And changing an asset management, taking that as a new process for making decisions is maybe not as drastic as getting rid of email, but it is definitely a big change in how people make decisions and what they do during the day. So I think it is just a change in thinking or changing culture.
Okay, thanks, Tim. It looks like we have a question from Ankita. Sorry, it just popped away from me. Ned, do you have that in front of you? Sorry, yes, it looks like, okay, so Ankita Mandilia has asked, is IWAM a way of implementing the One Water approach, or does it plug into it?
So
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Anna. I do think, and I know, Dan and Ned, you guys are sort of framing that your program is framed via IWAM, but from our perspective, I think it is a way of implementing or driving forward the One Water integrated water management approach. And I think it's about making your One Water investments in a way that is strategic and proactive, because as we've all discussed, what assets you have, the state of the assets, and what your goals or your outcomes are. And so it's just that sort of the business practice, as Tim has mentioned, of getting to that state of being able to implement as a smart utility or municipality.
Great, thanks. And I would say that I would agree that the One Water concept definitely comes to mind frequently working on this project. Although I would say we take it even one step further and say, it's one resource, because we're going beyond just the water utilities. So we're just about out of time now. So I'd like to just have some wrap-up notes and talk about some next steps. First off, I'd like to once again thank our panelists for taking time out of their busy days to present for us. And you guys have some really interesting ideas, and I hope that you've inspired some of the people on this call. So this has been our kickoff for this project, which we're very excited about here at the Great Lakes Commission. And we hope that you will join us for the second webinar of our series that is going to be focused on water infrastructure financing in IWAM. And we have that scheduled for Monday, March 18th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern. So you can all expect to see an email in the next week or so that will give you a link to register for that. And please spread the word and come back. We'd love to have you join us again. And in addition, we'd also like to keep this conversation going. So please contact us. You can email us or give me a call. We're easy to reach. You can find us on the Great Lakes Commission website. And on the next slide, I'll have a link to our email and website. But we would like to hear from you. If you have some ideas on what is IWAM that you don't think were represented today, we want to know what you think. If you have any literature or things that you think that we should be aware of that we might not be, to put into our literature review that will feed into our final report on all of this, send it our way. If there are other people who you didn't see on the call today or who you've interacted with who you think is a real leader in this area, let us know, and we'd love to connect with them. And furthermore, it's a little bit further down the line, but if anybody was inspired to think of any communities that they think would like to engage with us and potentially, maybe a year down the line, start looking into piloting some best practices for integrated water asset management, get in touch with us, and we'd like to talk to them as well. So I will end it 3 minutes early for everybody who's still on the line. I just want to thank you all again. You can visit our website and you can get more of an overview of the webinar series as well as this project in general. And you can contact me, dgold@glc.org, at any time if you want to talk about any of this. So thank you all very much. We hope to see you next time.